T-minus 39 minutes and counting.
Everything is A-OK. Thank you, Siri.
Your wish is my command.
And why wouldn't it be? So, there we go. Thank you for Siri. And we're just going to make sure that everything is still working here. We're on there, and there. Beautiful. And we have coffee. Can you guys see this? This is one of my favorite mugs. Cat in the Hat. By the way, if you go out to the tree that is decorated just to the south of the middle school building, some of you may be aware that that tree was planted for my wife. And her favorite, she was all about literacy when it came to education. And one of her favorites was Dr. Seuss' Cat in the Hat. And I'm a big fan. So there you go. Okay. With that, we are going to get back into where we left off last time, which is that water analogy of electricity. Stand by. I love me some Sumatran coffee. So, here we are. So here we have our water pump, or alternator, pushing the water, or electricity, here to something called this primary bus. We have these circuit breakers that are between this bus and these instruments. So again, remember this circuit breaker here. We're going to talk about that here in just a second. So we have a circuit breaker that goes between the source of this electricity and the instrument itself. It's there to protect the instrument. Do you remember that little thing that I called that little electrical spike occasionally? Do you think that some of these delicate instruments like these spikes in electricity, or they just want that constant flow? It would be the latter. That's what they're after. They don't like that spike in electricity. So if that spike in electricity happens, that will trip this circuit breaker. And this little circuit breaker thing that you guys have seen those on instrument panels, it'll kind of pop out. And so when that pops out, it interrupts that flow of electricity from the bus to that instrument. In some cases, we as pilots may actually pull one of these circuit breakers. Here's an example. Let's say, for instance, that you have an autopilot that is misbehaving. Do you want that autopilot to put your airplane in some maneuver that could jeopardize your safety or the safety of those in your airplane or on the ground? No, we wouldn't. So in some cases, if it's not behaving properly, you can turn the autopilot off. If that doesn't work, you pull the circuit breaker for the autopilot. The autopilot has an ability to actually kind of adjust the pitch of your airplane, and there have been instances where that pitch has kind of run away and it just keeps climbing and climbing and climbing until it ultimately stalls the airplane. You clearly don't want that to happen. So you should be able to overpower the autopilot with force on the control surface, and then again you pull that circuit breaker to stop that electricity, and then off you go. Keep this in mind. If a circuit breaker pops, you may only reset that circuit breaker one time, and that is only if you do not smell smoke. If a circuit breaker pops and you smell smoke, leave it alone. That circuit breaker popped for a reason. Don't reset it. But if a circuit breaker pops and you don't smell smoke and everything else seems normal, you can reset the circuit breaker one time. There have been instances where pilots have attempted to reset a circuit breaker multiple times. Remember, that circuit breaker pops for a reason. Something is wrong electrically with this system. By continuing to reset that circuit breaker, you're asking this problem to reoccur, and that problem reoccurring could ultimately lead to an in-flight fire. That would be bad. So you may reset a circuit breaker one time only, please, if you do not smell smoke. If you smell smoke, don't touch nothing. Get that plane on the ground as soon as you can. Okay. Now, so here we go. So here you see things like your gyros. We haven't really talked about the gyros yet because we haven't got into the instruments yet. Panel lights, your radios, this CIG. Used to be that we'd have things in there called cigarette lighters in the airplanes, because, who doesn't want to smoke in an airplane? So landing lights, nav lights. Then you have something else. You'll see that you have another bus down here. This is a bus called the avionics bus, primary bus, and this is the avionics bus. So let's think about what a bus is. A bus is a panel, and in this panel it will have several instruments all connected to this. You will have something called a primary bus. You could have something in your airplane called a secondary bus. You may also have a tertiary bus. Primary, secondary, tertiary. These are groups of electrical instruments all joined to one switch, if you will, or one panel that can be turned on or off by the pilot. So if we look here at what's happening in this illustration, you can see that you have a primary bus here. Then you can see where you have a connection here that goes through a switch to something called an avionics bus. Well, here you see a radio, nav. Well, you also, if you look above here, you can see that you've got something up here perhaps that has one radio on it, one navigation source, one gyro instrument. So you think, why would you have that on there? The reason that you separate those is in the event of an electrical issue. Let's say, for instance, no, we're not going to say that at all because I'm going to show you here in these other slides. Okay, so we can see here we have the electricity flowing here into this primary bus. We can see one little pipe of the water going to this avionics bus, but we have a switch that we can say we want that on or off. Then we can also see that we have another little pipe here going through something here called our battery. In this case, this is our main battery. The main battery in an airplane, its primary function is to start the engine of your airplane. That's its primary function. The secondary function of that main battery is to provide electricity in the event of a power failure. And this little street right here, oops, let me go this little pipe, this can be a two-way street. So in this case, we have the water or electricity flowing here into this battery, charging the battery as we kind of go along. But if for some reason we lose that ability to generate electricity or water here in this thing, this street can be turned back around and electricity can be sent back from that battery to this bus. Okay? So keep that in mind. We look at the flow of electricity and we think about a circuit. So this is kind of a circuit. So here you can see you got a battery, here's your little wires, it goes to the light, and from the light that wire goes back to the battery. This allows everything to work. If you have a break in that flow, just like if you had a break in the line of a pipe, that water or electricity is not going to get here to turn this thing on. So with this, we look at some form here, this little symbol, these little slashed triangles, they talk about this being a conductor or a switch. It's something that still allows that electricity to flow through here because without the flow, that light is a no-go. Okay? So that's kind of how that works. The light switch in your house interrupts that signal or allows it to flow. That's what a switch does. So now let's look here. Here's our water pump. Now we have a circuit breaker here between this and some form of some meter and a primary bus. Remember what this is. Here's your secondary or avionics bus, and here is this flow into the battery. So we have a circuit breaker here for the alternator. It's a switch that can come on or off in this if you have alternator issues. You also have the ability to see what kind of a load am I putting on the system with this particular gauge, okay? So if we look here, remember here in this A configuration, here's the water pump working, water current is flowing, it's flowing to all the instruments in the primary bus, and this little pipe right here is putting that electricity back into this battery, so the battery is being charged while the airplane is in flight. So while the alternator is producing the current to power all of these instruments, the battery is being charged. Any kind of a discharge over here goes out the system. Now then, if we look at B, what happens when this alternator is not working? If for whatever reason this generator or alternator is not producing electricity, then what will happen is this battery will become the source of electricity to push back up this street to push that electricity to this primary bus. But we know that that battery, there is a finite amount of electrons that can be pulled from that battery. So we know that if something happens to that alternator, we are on the clock, meaning we have a limited amount of time available to us to get this airplane safely on the ground to sort out whatever problem that there is with this alternator. So that's kind of what it is. If your operating handbook says that you have 45 minutes of power in that battery, you have 22 and a half. Cut that in half. If your backup battery says you have 30 minutes, count on 15. Be conservative. Worst case scenario, 22 and a half minutes, that allows you to get this airplane down at almost any airport that has a mechanic to it. So you've got time, but use it wisely, okay? So now, here we go. Here's our alternator. Alternator here, sending this electricity through here. Here's the load meter. Then it goes through this primary bus, and remember this little pipe here goes to the battery, but this little indicator here tells us whether or not we are charging the battery or if it's discharging. If it's discharging, we're pulling electrons from the battery, so that tells us that we have a problem. If it's charging, that tells us that everything is working normally. And that's one of the engine instruments that we have to make sure that the electrical system is functioning properly. So as we look here, we can see, okay, so here we are. We're charging this battery as it's going through here and it's being charged. We can see that here on the discharge ammeter, it's showing that we're having a positive number over here, meaning that the electricity is flowing into the battery or the battery is being charged. If for whatever reason we're pulling power from the battery, it is being discharged. Because remember, this battery is just a case. This is all it is. And the electricity that's in this battery, that's it. And so when it's being pulled out of there, this is that part where we say we're on the clock. So when you have a negative side over here on the amps, it's showing that you're pulling power from the battery, meaning something is wrong. If you look at the two different types of ammeters, you've got a couple of different ones. One is basically sort of a simple charge-discharge ammeter. And again, like the previous illustration showed, if the needle is over here on the positive side, it's showing that it's getting a charge. If it's over here on the negative side, it's showing that there's a discharge. We can also look here on this one, looking at the type of alternator amps coming out of here, and it'll show the actual load meter. It'll show the load on the system. So normally that load is going to be about right here, which again is going to be about 16 amps. That's normally about where we are when we have all of the stuff powered up on our airplane. So right here, we're showing this load meter with about a 16 amp deflection, meaning everything is working good. Everything is working just the way that we need it. And remember what I said, this electrical equipment on this particular bus uses about 16 amps of that flow through those wires, okay? So that's kind of the load on this. Now if we look at this, and all of a sudden we see a load here of now we've got like 50 amps coming out of here, what do you think is about to happen with these circuit breakers right here? Yep, they're all about to pop. And so with that, if we start to see that our alternator is not working correctly, it's producing more electricity than it's supposed to, we have a situation that we call a runaway alternator. It's a runaway alternator. So if we look here at stopping a runaway alternator, I want to turn your attention back here to these two switches. So if you guys remember that over here on this illustration, I showed you that there are actually on a master switch 2 switches. You have one here that says Alt, standing for alternator. The other one that says BAT, standing for my favorite DC comic book character, Batman. No, I'm teasing. That's not what that stands for. It stands for the battery, okay? So now if we look back here, we can see here's this master switch, the alternator and the battery side. We have a voltage regulator kind of running the pressure here for this, and sometimes this thing can get messed up where it doesn't sense the proper pressure flowing through this alternator or this water pump for whatever reason. So if we look at this and this thing starts to run away, this gets way too much information here, way too much electricity, the load meter is going nuts, the amp charge meter is going nuts. What we do is we will turn the left side of this switch, remember this switch here, we will turn the left side of this switch off. Now, how many of you have ever heard this? If you're angry, stop, count to 10. You ever heard that? Anybody ever said that to you? Stop, count to 10. 10, not tend. 10. It's just kind of like, you know, when somebody is sending one of these text messages back and forth and somebody says something that kind of irritates you and you're just about to send kind of a nasty message back to them. Stop, count to 10, see if that's still really a good idea. Because remember, text messages, tweets, they live forever. You think you can erase them, but you can't, okay? Count to 10. Don't hit send, okay? When you turn off that alternator, if you sense that you have a runaway alternator that's producing way too much electricity than your system can hold, turn off the alternator side, that left switch on that master switch, turn it off, count to 10. And here's why. You still have a little residual flow from a current standpoint, that amperage, flowing through these wires. That still exists. It lasts anywhere from like a couple seconds to maybe 5 or 6. So you shut it completely down and you turn that alternator breaker off and count to 10 before you turn it back on, because that's ultimately what we're going to do here. So we turn this off and we're going to count to 10. What happens here is that resets the current coming through here, and it resets the switch for this voltage regulator and for the alternator. If that happens in flight and you turn off that alternator, count to 10, then turn it back on and see if that solves your problem. We call that cycling the alternator, okay? By cycling the alternator, we turn it off, we count to 10, we turn it back on again, That's what we call cycling the alternator. In most cases, that may fix your problem, but not in all cases. Now, here's a question that I have for you. Here you are, you're flying along, all fat and happy, and then you notice that you've got an overboost system here with your electricity. You shut your alternator off, you count to 10 because the big bulb man told you to. Let's go ahead and count to 10, shall we? 1, 2, 3, 7, 8, 9, 10. Turn the switch back on. Let's see how we're doing. Does this fix the problem? Yes, it fixes the problem. Are we good? Not necessarily. Now is when you check everything, make sure everything is working properly, make sure everything is on, functioning the way that it's supposed to. But we're going to be watching this, right? We're going to be looking for that little piece of electricity issue that we have. We are also on our knee board or some kind of a device inside of our cockpit. We're going to make a note. Had to cycle the alternator in flight. You put the time that you did it, and you put any little notes on there that you observed during this process. You know why you're going to do that? Because when you land this airplane, you're going to let your mechanic know this is what happened. I had to do this. What the heck? It's probably a good idea to have your mechanic take a look at that before you fly somewhere else, right? So don't just think that you have magically reset everything and nothing can possibly go wrong from here. If that happened, it happened for a reason. There's some form of an underlying issue somewhere that created that situation. You do not want to ignore it and pretend it just didn't happen, okay? So just keep that in mind. Okay. Now, so here we go, handling a high or low voltage warning light. That's what this is. Step 1, turn avionics master switch off. Why do we want to turn the avionics off? Why do we want to turn off our avionics before we do anything else? Remember that spike in electricity thing that I talked to you about? This helps prevent that spike in electricity happening to some other instrument, okay? So that first thing you're going to do is turn the avionics switch off. Then, number 2, if the circuit breakers have popped, if you do not smell smoke, you are going to reset them, okay? Then, on step 3, you are going to, if the master switch is on, you're going to turn both sides off, count to 10, and then turn them back on again, okay? And then we're going to check, did that help our system? Now you'll see in this particular airplane, this is just a little light that comes on that says you have either a low or high voltage warning. There's a problem there. And we call this we call this a dummy light, meaning a light comes on. Okay, so what's going on? Well, we don't know. Why not? Because that switch is a dummy. It's a dummy light. We just don't know. This is why we have gauges. It's why we have meters, is to show us these things so that we can see for ourselves kind of what's happening. In the G1000 systems, we don't have very many dummy lights. We have actual gauges and meters that can show us the status of this flow versus, oops, something's wrong. Okay. So in the more modern aircraft, this is what we have. Back in that bucket of bolts that I used to fly, I'm guessing that probably that low voltage indicator light didn't even work. That would be my guess, but I could be wrong. My point here is this. There is a methodology for you to handle emergencies like this in the air. In your airplane flight manual or your pilot operating handbook, the AFM or the POH, you pull that up, PDQ. You see what I did there, PDQ? That stands for pretty darn quick. You open up the emergency operations section, you pull to the electrical thing, and you read that checklist. It shows you the flow of how you handle this. When you start learning how to use your AFM or your POH, one of the areas that you're going to pay special attention to is the emergency section of that book, so that you know what emergencies that there are. You run those in your head, you sit there in your airplane and you say, okay, I just got this indication, what do I do? You flip open to that, you read through it, you practice that. You don't want to flip to that little red tab in that AFM or POH for the first time when you're actually having an issue. That's not the time to have opened that and say, I wonder what we got in here. You need to know that, and that's where this stuff comes from, okay? So with this is kind of how you learn how to flow, what it is that you need to do in the event that you have an issue. Okay. So here we are. Now then, the water analogy of electricity. Here's the water pump. Everything looks like it's going through here pretty well. Everything looks pretty normal here, right? This is what this looks like. So this picture right here is this picture right here. This is kind of the rudimentary look of what we call an electrical schematic. Remember when I showed you this early on? Now you can look at this here in figure 7-34, and now it can start to make a little more sense to you versus when you saw this thing before. Am I right or am I right? So with this, you can see where all of the little connections come from, okay? So as we look at this, we can see, here's our master switch, here's our battery, low volt out, power in, here's your alternator circuit breaker, and you can see here's your lights that you may have. Whoops, oops, hold on. Yep, there it is. The low voltage light. You can see these things all basically listed out for you here on your primary bus. These are all of the things that are going to be on this primary control system. On the secondary or the avionics bus, here's where this is. Now, one of the things that I want to show you is that with this, you can see that you have 3 or 4 or 5 different radios all attached to this avionics bus. Well, do you have to have a radio to land an airplane? No, not really. What do you have to have? Well, assuming that you're in the clouds, you got to have something that's going to power up some instrument to tell you if you're right side up or you're upside down. Probably some navigation source that you have, and probably a light or two, an ability to put the gear down or whatever you need. In normal cases, a manufacturer will have on that primary bus only the instruments that you must have to be able to land that airplane in an emergency. But not always. The way that they have the stuff set up for the Diamond DA40, on your primary bus, you're going to have one radio, you're going to have one navigation source, you're going to have your primary instruments, and that's it. Your secondary nav, your secondary radio or comms, and these other things that are nice to have instruments are going to be on a separate bus. So it's easy for the pilot that in an emergency, if you need to say, okay, I'm now pulling all of my electricity from the main battery, I don't necessarily need all of these things on, because if I'm pulling 16 amps off this thing all at once, it's not going to take long to pull the rest of the volts that I have in that battery, the rest of the electricity, out of that battery. So to keep as many electrons in there and use as few electrons as I have, I want to lighten my load. So I want to pare everything down to just the instruments that I absolutely have to have in the event that I have an emergency like this. So that's kind of how they sort of work it. Then you have a backup battery. You have another battery that has a little shield on it, that if you use all of the electricity in your main battery, you can flip this switch over here and go to a standby battery that can give you a little more power for a little longer period of time. Again, as a backup. So that's kind of how this system works. So if we look here at these, we can see this is sort of how it goes. But I want you, the reason I'm showing you this is because I don't want you to think that this is the way it is for all airplanes. Each airplane is different. Each airplane will have certain elements on a primary bus, other instruments on a secondary or alternate bus, okay? So now you can see that we're going to make this a little more complex. Down here where we used to have this little battery, well, we can see here that we actually have a little brain box that controls which way the electricity moves. So we have a regulator here on this in much the same way that we have a regulator here on our alternator. We have these solenoids or these relay switches. Remember those little triangular shaped little objects that we saw when we looked at a circuit to kind of see how that runs? Well, this turns this on and off. And these little solenoids or these relays are going to be those little things that are installed in that wiring or the plumbing of this so that we can control the flow of electricity through these instruments. So we have all of these contacts here, we have the circuit breakers here, we have the solenoid here that can send electricity when we want it to go, and that's kind of it. So if we look over here, let's take a look. So here we have the battery. Here's our main battery. We have a battery contactor here. We have to start the airplane. Here's our key to turn the ignition on. That ignition fires up both these magnetos, which gets its electricity from this battery because of the fact that this battery contactor is sending it over here, sends a signal to the starter, which pops out this little guy to turn the flywheel, which begins turning the propeller, which again turns the crankshaft, which moves the pistons inside that engine, which creates 1, 2, 3, and 4 intake, compression, the intake, compression, combustion, and exhaust strokes on our engine. It starts the engine. When that engine starts now, we can then turn on the alternator switch. We have turned on our battery switch. I should have said that at the beginning. We turn on the battery switch to allow that electricity to go. Then once we get the engine started, it starts, the engine is running. We check our oil pressure to make sure that we have oil pressure. Then we turn on the alt side of the master switch. The reason that we don't want to turn them both on at the same time is because it kind of puts a little additional wear on that alternator. And again, remember, we're not pulling electricity from the alternator to start the engine. We're pulling it from the main battery. And so to make that work, we just turn on the battery side of that switch. And then once we get the engine started and everything is working normally, that's when we turn the alternator side on. We turn the alternator side on, let that kind of fire up, and then we turn the avionics on. Then we check everything and make sure everything is working properly. Making sure that on our ammeter here that we're producing electricity that's being sent to the battery to keep the battery charged. Make sure that we're positive there. Make sure that we haven't popped any circuit breakers here in the process, okay? And this is kind of how all of this stuff works. But I think that you will, I think you'll have to agree with me that Mr. Machado, and when he uses kind of that water analogy of electricity, kind of how much more simple it kind of makes it and a little bit easier to understand. At least I hope that's the outcome here. Hang on here. I've got to tend to my cat in a hat. Stand by. Oh, that's good. So there we go. There's that electricity part, kind of how all of that works. This is an example of an amp meter. You can see here you've got a charging side, you have a discharging side. There's your load meter showing kind of where it's going to go. We look at this. These are some of the instruments that as a pilot we monitor during flight. So we're constantly looking for these things, and we're constantly making sure that our engine is happy, making sure that we're going the right way, the right altitude, we're on the right frequency with our comms, and we're looking at the electrical load on our airplane. Is everything electrically looking the way it's supposed to? We constantly have to monitor that. And it's one of the things that makes flying, you know, kind of challenging, but challenging in a good way. In most cars, they don't have that. What do you have in there? In a car, you're going to have basically a speedometer and a fuel gauge. Those really are the only things that people look at beyond their cell phones when they're texting and driving. Oh my Lord. Oh, I don't even know if I should even say this. Yesterday, it just defied description. I'm sitting at a traffic light. This is when I'm bringing Sebastian back from having surgery. Sitting at this light, and I'm in this middle lane. The person in front of me is on their cell phone. The people beside me are on their cell phones. The light turns green, and I'm sitting there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then I start laying into the horn. And then everybody's heads come up like, oh my gosh, what just happened here? And the guy in front of me flips me off. It's hard to take, kids. It's hard to take. Pay attention, people. Anyway, it's the things that we monitor. This is one of the things that separates us as pilots and these other people. Okay, just saying. So, landing gear, another system. We have landing gear here like a Cessna. You can see here, can these landing gear, are these retractable? Negative. This gear is down and welded, meaning that it is fixed gear. This gear can't go up and down. But we do have airplanes that do have gear that can go up and down. In that, you have an electrically activated hydraulic system that raises and lowers the landing gear. So you have an electrical switch that sends a signal to a hydraulic pump that then pumps fluid, hydraulic fluid, cleverly enough, into the system that raises and lowers the gear. In landing gear that have retractable gear, there are also fail-safes that you have for the gear, and ultimately including either a blowdown system where you have landing gear that have in these pumps this one-time use only nitrogen charged canister that will actually blow the gear down, meaning that it'll fill that system with the nitrogen, pumps that up, the gear goes down. But it's a one-time use only thing. It has to be serviced after that because, again, you're not using the fluid through there because you're not using the pump. You're using a separate canister. Or in the old Seneca, you had a pump thing where you could actually like reach over onto this thing and manually kind of, the old duck on the wall tells us that we're done here. So again, the landing gear, that's kind of one of the last systems that we're going to touch on. We're not really going to we're not really going to go over the pressurization of cockpits here. The oxygen system we'll talk about another time. De-ice we'll get into another time. And so from this, now what we're going to do is I want you to start reading now chapter 8. We have finished 7. It's time to begin reading chapter 8. Chapter 8. On Monday, we will get through the first 20 pages of chapter 8. Chapter 8. Okay? Guys, thank you very much. Have a fabulous weekend, and we will be talking to you guys here just really, really soon. And I'm continuing to talk while I'm trying to find the little switch that's going to turn all this stuff off. That's kind of what I'm doing. It's sort of stalling here, like with this. Yeah, I'm trying to figure it out. There we go. Okay, guys, have a great weekend. Miss ya. Happy Hanukkah. See ya.